So my name is Meryl Alper, and I am just very happy to chat with you all this evening. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northeastern, and also an affiliate associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. So thank you so much to Megan and the Boston Ability Center for hosting and organizing. My talk today is titled Kids Across the Spectrums, Supporting Autistic Children's Friendships in the Digital Age. I should note that this presentation unfortunately includes discussions of some upsetting topics as it relates to the darker side of interpersonal relationships and mental health. And that includes issues such as suicide and issues such as bullying. So before I begin, I'd also like to share a little bit about myself and my background. So I started my professional career in the children's media industry back when I was in college, back in 2003, when I interned in the education and research department at Sesame Workshop, specifically working on Sesame Street. And since then, I've worked as a consultant, strategist, and educational researcher for companies like Nick Jr. and Disney Channel. And I currently independently consult with organizations like PBS Kids and Apple TV, helping to make their series, their digital and interactive offerings more accessible and universally designed. And some of the shows that I've worked on, which is those pictured here, have diversity and inclusion as explicit curriculum goals and educational philosophies. That includes, as I mentioned, Sesame Street, also a show, PBS Kids, Molly of Denali, a show that used to be on Nick Jr. called Ni Hao Kai Lan, and another PBS Kids show, Hero Elementary. And the latter is especially notable in the context of this talk, as one of the show's lead characters, AJ Sparks, is a tech-savvy Black autistic boy. I'll also note, hope this doesn't come across as a plug, but there is another PBS Kids series coming out later, I believe in the fall, called Carl the Collector. And it explicitly has an autistic cast, autistic producers, writers, advisors, and it isn't a show necessarily about autism. It's a kind of a show that has a wider curriculum, but I think that parents of kids on the spectrum, and hopefully all parents, will find something lovable and something very endearing about the show. You know, to think about, you know, what kinds of representation exists for kids, many of whom on the spectrum are massive lovers and consumers of PBS Kids content. So I've been a professor at Northeastern since 2015, and in my work there, accessibility, and more specifically disability, has been central to my research on young people's engagement with media and technology, including both the pros and cons of digital, personal, and mobile media. I started this work because I noticed how disabled children were more often talked about as patients or perhaps students in the context of technology, but not as everyday kids with dreams and desires that play out through their media usage. So I've written 3 books on the topic, all with MIT Press, that are pictured here. Digital Youth with Disabilities, Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability, and Inequality, which focus specifically on AAC users. And most recently, Kids Across the Spectrums, Growing Up Autistic in the Digital Age, which my talk will focus on tonight. So I should say the book is available for free, not in print, but digitally on the MIT Press website. And I've made it kind of easy for you if you just go to the link bit.ly/kids across the spectrums. You can get to the open access version of the book there. So I'm proud to say that the book is the first ever in-depth ethnographic study of what diverse autistic children and adolescents are doing with media and technology in their daily lives. It's also a reflection on what it means just to be social in this hyper-connected era that we live in. I use spectrums like kind of in the multiple ways here. So I'm talking about autism, even though kind of there's some discussion about how spectrum is itself not the best metaphor necessarily. Spectrum as in media, so like radio, the radio spectrum that media runs on, and the socioeconomic spectrum as well. And recently the book was awarded an honorable mention from a division of the American Sociological Association, which I was very proud of. So when it comes to framing autism as a concept, as an inclusion criteria for my study. I understand autism, and I say this as a non-autistic person, in the broadest possible terms, to be a cognitive, biological, and behavioral phenomenon that influences how people move, think, and perceive the world around them. Some people on the spectrum are very talkative, while others may be unable to reliably communicate through oral speech. Some are intellectually gifted, while others have significant cognitive challenges. Some are highly sociable, while others prefer greater solitude. And this diversity is reflected in the rainbow infinity symbol pictured here. So people are born autistic and remain so throughout their lives, but there is far more research on children than adults. This illustration shows a girl navigating a rainbow path surrounded by different media forms and platforms, including smartphones, social media, and personal gaming consoles. Through media, today's autistic youth can discover unique opportunities for communicating, expressing themselves, and exploring their interests. For example, though this isn't my research, and I can point people to where this research is, but autistic adolescent boys report that video gaming with others helps them to feel part of a group, and in ways that they might not necessarily feel in face-to-face encounters. But teens on the spectrum also encounter specific online threats. So other research says that they often experience bullying due to their peers' lack of acceptance of their differences. And these personal violations are complicated by the fact that privacy and safety features on social media can be difficult for them to understand and modify. And this extends through sort of teens, adolescents into autistic young adults. So in the book, I identify 3 overlapping areas of autistic children's successes and struggles with technology. And those areas are cultural belonging, social relationships, and physical embodiment. So I examine how autistic youth make sense of where they belong culturally in terms of their identities in chapter 2, and in their learning environments in chapter 3. I study the kinds of personal relationships that they forge with family and friends in chapter 4 and chapter 5, and where media fits in within that. And I try to understand their embodied experiences of neurodivergence and the technological components of that, and namely young people, autistic people's sensory processing in chapter 6 and emotional processing in chapter 5. My talk today, I can't really go into every aspect of the book, so I'm going to focus just on chapter 5, the friendship chapter. In the Q&A portion, though, I'm more than happy to talk about some of my findings from the other chapters, and also just to point people in general to research that's being done at the moment that expands some of this discussion. So friendship. What is it? It's not as easy to define as you might necessarily think. But friendship is certainly one area of development in which young people on the autism spectrum can struggle. And really young people with disabilities in general, I should say, related to different forms of social stigma, the way that classrooms look, the ways that other kinds of social activities are organized, places where kids hang out. But for autistic kids specifically, many have difficulty interpreting why people communicate in the way that they do, regulating their emotions, and understanding often invisible rules of neurotypical conversation. So are conversation styles that are preferred by those who display typical intellectual and cognitive development. In other ways, though, their friendships are like those of neurotypical children. So other research shows that their closest friendships are also mostly made at school, and they also tend to prefer same-gender friends. Similarly, also current research suggests that how children on the spectrum engage with technology for social purposes isn't completely dissimilar from non-autistic kids. So both boys and girls on the spectrum, though, are at an increased risk for cyberbullying. And that's actually even among other young people with disabilities. So being autistic sort of heightens that potential risk. And that might be related to all of these other things that I mentioned, might make conversing or being on the internet and understanding those social norms and the technical landscape potentially even more complicated. So in my talk tonight, what I want to do is provide you just a little bit more of a background on the role of media and technology in child friendships overall. some of the specific social strengths and challenges that autistic youth face, and also then what's known about how technology potentially increases their feelings of belonging and exclusion at the same time. I'll then detail some of the research findings from the book and offer reflections on friendship and the implications and some implications for how the social spaces that autistic youth inhabit might be better designed, used, and regulated. And lastly, I'll conclude with hopefully a few helpful tips, I hope, that are from kind of across the book that might be useful for parents navigating the digital world with their neurodivergent child. Okay. So to start off with, in terms of friendship development and media in childhood. So tweens and teens in general today build relationships in several ways, obviously both online and offline. But online, that includes content sharing sites, messaging apps, virtual worlds, and networked games. Social media use specifically is associated with both interpersonal benefits for adolescents and interpersonal challenges. Benefits can include a sense of belonging and social capital. So that means a kind of a larger, richer social network. The challenges can include experiences with relational aggression and perceived isolation. Tween social media use is on the rise, though boys do tend to make more friends online than girls. And that's in part related to the fact that regular video game play expands their social circles. Girls in general, though, are more likely to text frequently with existing friends. So sort of different media, different purposes with which young people in general choose the media that they are using for different kind of social goals that they're trying to meet. And young people very intentionally, make these choices. Autistic children, in terms of their social strengths and challenges, tend to be more accepted by typically developing peers in younger grades, but later often move to the edge of social networks. Despite their challenges, other research, and I've listed a bunch of this work here, kids on the spectrum report desiring friends. And for the most part, many of them do say that they are generally satisfied by their friendships, but they might vary from neurotypical children in terms of their preferred frequency and type of social contact. In other words, autistic kids' peer relationships can sometimes look different from non-autistic children's friendships. They might have less emotional intimacy and affective reciprocity. One parent that I interviewed said that her kid is like the mayor of his classroom at school, and then as soon as he gets home, he forgets about you. So there's this kind of wide range here of, again, like social goals and kind of social intentions. So it's important to note then that the differences here are not necessarily deficits. In terms of their participation in online social spaces and technology use, children on the spectrum, those ages 3 to 13, who are excluded in play by other kids, so again, thinking about this offline social dynamic, the kids who are excluded in these physical spaces are more likely to occupy their time with media. Among autistic adolescents, social media use is associated with high self-reported friendship quality. So, more social media use if you're autistic, high self-reported friendship quality. But as anybody who kind of studies statistics and kind of questions, well, what's the relationship there? It's unclear what aspect of social media might be associated with strong friendships. And it's hard to determine, why that is. Could it be that social media improves autistic kids' friendships? Or another likely scenario is that those who already have strong friendships are more likely to use social media. So the directionality is really hard to thread apart. So to summarize, again, this is sort of what do we know already. Media and communication technologies may offer children on the spectrum new opportunities for social connection, but it can potentially create a lot of roadblocks as well. Researchers have yet to actually spend much time directly speaking with autistic young people about how they navigate the mediated social world. More often, it tends to be primarily or exclusively interviews with parents or with teachers or surveys. But I kind of wanted to get closer to the source, the original source. And that's what I do in my book. So how did I go about doing this work? In general, research with children on the autism spectrum involves many practical, ethical, and communicative considerations. So I began my research as part of my dissertation in Los Angeles, and that was around 2013, 2014, and then continued the work here in Boston from 2016 up to the very start of the pandemic in 2020. 58 households with 62 autistic children between the ages of 3 and 13 took part. The average age was 7. And all names that I mentioned in the talk are pseudonyms, so fake names to protect identities. To give you a sense of the diversity of the sample, so the average yearly household incomes were nearly split between those earning more or less than $100,000 per year, with 10 of those kids living in households earning less than $25,000, which is, again, generally more diverse socioeconomically than most samples, convenient samples of kids, of autistic kids tend to be. The child sample was roughly half white, half non-white, and consisted of more boys than girls, which is, reflective in part of sort of underlying genetic factors and a whole host of other potential social determinants of gender gaps in autism diagnoses. In addition to autism, several parents indicated that their children had additional diagnoses, and that included communication impairment, ADHD, anxiety, and epilepsy. So interviews of 60 to 120 minutes were conducted in English and in person with parents. The children were all also observed at home, engaging in a favorite media activity that they selected, and that observation lasted 30 to 60 minutes. Additionally, some of the kids who were speaking and some who were non-speaking were able to assent to being interviewed. For some of those kids, that involved a modified form. So for one family, the child was sort of typed back responses, or the parents sort of then transcribed them and edited them and sent them back to me. Or some kids for whom they needed some additional support during the interview had a parent nearby, and they would ask the parent, what's that YouTube channel that I was banned from? Or the things that they just needed to help supplement their responses to me. And then some kids who did not have an adequate communication system just were not able to participate in any form of interview, which was very unfortunate. So the questions that I asked parents and kids that pertain to this specific talk were, for parents, how has your child's experience been with making and keeping friends? How do you think media and technology has helped or hurt your child in this respect? And has your child ever been cyberbullied? And if so, what happened? For the kids, what I asked them, and all of them were sort of tweaked in different ways depending on, the age of the actual kid. But questions like, what makes someone a good friend? Do you use any technology to talk to your friends outside of school? Has anyone ever been mean to you online, like with texting, with messaging in a video game, on Instagram? What did the other person do? So what did I find? That many autistic children are savvy curators of their personal media ecosystems. They can feel comfortable reaching out and being reached out to by others. But, this is a big but, being connected also exposes them to social situations with a lot of potential for harm and victimization. And there turns out to be very little protection that platforms offer. These platforms may have changed somewhat in the years that I have, since I kind of published this, but I'm not quite sure how far those changes have gone or how even aware parents are of them, of the platform modifications. And it also can be very hard for them to articulate seeking help from adults in the first place with their challenges. So specifically, there are 4 main themes that emerge from my analysis. The ways that autistic kids use media for social scaffolding and support, so sort of learning about how to be a friend. Second is their agency in using media for social purposes, sort of like the active choices that they make. Third is the struggles that they have in navigating online safety in social interactions. And then the fourth is various social factors that shape the context of how media plays a role in their friendships. It's kind of the factors outside of just their individual choices or sort of lives. So I'm going to delve basically into one or two key examples from each theme, using some storytelling, some of the kind of specific details from these kids' lives and their parents. So with respect to scaffolding and support, media and technology can serve as an on-ramp to social participation for kids on the spectrum, or a way to let them practice being social in a safe way sometimes. So for example, 12-year-old Brendan showed me videos from one of his favorite gamers on YouTube, Markiplier. We watched one video that Brendan had viewed many times before, in which Markiplier played a game called Little Nightmares, which is a horror adventure game. And Brendan enabled the video's captions on screen so that he could read aloud what Markiplier was saying. And not just that, he was using that text to simulate conversations with the YouTuber. And just a screenshot of the video itself and like what Markiplier was saying appears here. So at one point, Markiplier says, "I don't know where I am now," in reference to where he is in the game, location-wise. To which Brendan replied with a kind of friendly familiarity, "You never know where you are, Mark." In this, kind of way, interacting with media figures and building what is in the research referred to as parasocial relationships, building kinds of bonds with a media figure, enabled autistic kids to play at sociality, sort of in a practice way with a person. Wasn't interactive, was pseudo-interactive, but playing at sociality using media and technology. And there's more examples of this kind of, whether it's like scripting with learning social scripts from TV shows that then were scripts that then kids used on the playground, but then that potentially then led to other relationships that weren't, in conversations that weren't scripted to develop. So again, this sense of media and technology as a kind of social scaffolding. In terms of agency, or being able to make your own decisions, for a lot of kids, while there's the kind of figure of being the passive recipient of the effects of technology. And that's not to say that some kids were absolutely, had very little control over the kinds of YouTube ads that they got served, or Netflix would autoplay, and so they'd be still, kind of stuck in that loop of the media kind of happening to them. Young people on the spectrum, though, do make active choices about the media that they use. And in this case, how and when they use it socially and in what circumstances. So for instance, virtual and in-person clubs centered around specific media franchises allowed autistic tweens to regularly connect with peers who had similar interests. 10-year-old Ronan, for example, played the Dungeons and Dragons card game, shown here. And he got together with friends to play in an organized group every other Sunday. Of course, that was facilitated by Ronan's parents. When I asked him what he liked about playing D&D with these friends, Ronan joked, quote, "You can't really single-handedly take down like 1,000,000 monsters when they all have to make attacks against you. You're the only thing out there for them to attack if there's no friends." So thinking about how games in this way and the choices that young people made was another way to sort of actively make choices about collaboration, about alliances, about kind of social problem solving. And that was something that was important to a number of the kids that I spent time with. So another component, though, that's really important to talk about is security. So pre-adolescent kids on the spectrum are also coming of age in a networked environment with endless potential for their social vulnerabilities to be taken advantage of by cruel actors. For example, Brendan, who I mentioned before, his mom, Marcia, recalled a time in which her son wrote, "Can we be friends?" Kind of the quote he was, "Can we be friends?" ? On social media. And he typed that into the chat on Roblox, like how it's pictured here. And this had surprised her. She said, quote, "Even though he wants friends, he doesn't know how to probably maintain those relationships," end quote. She worried about Brendan not being able to determine another person's bad intentions, not only from the outside world of strangers, but also children from school with whom Brendan sometimes played Roblox, and who also had victimized him in school as well. So these are kids for whom, and I'll get this into the next example, like who is a friend and who's not a friend, can be very, very hard for these kids, for kids on the spectrum to understand. And that is also the case here in my next example. So also speaking of safety, Maggie, who was the mom of 12-year-old Sailor, discussed with a really heavy heart about how her daughter had been bullied by girls that she thought were her friends. The illustration that's pictured here, which reflects this theme, was actually created by an autistic girl and depicts feelings of loneliness. What had happened for Sailor is that the girls told her to post on Snapchat about wanting to take her own life, which Sailor then posted out of peer pressure. Another mother saw the message on her child's Snapchat and contacted Maggie, who went into crisis mode. These were girls where Sailor, in person, they had sort of claimed to be her friend, but would also make fun of her. And so it was really hard for her to tell who was a friend and who wasn't. But by age 12, when I talked with her, Sailor was able to reflect on her experiences and talk about them as part of her past. She was also, I should say, attending counseling to talk about issues that she experienced. She was able to talk about kind of what she had gone through in terms of her past, as well as the current context of what it means to be a young person, a tween or a teen online. She said, quote, "The year I got bullied, I always got picked on for having really bad Instagram photos. I was like 9 and I didn't know. I just wanted to be cool and stuff." She then did learn, with Maggie's help, how to change some of her privacy settings. So she did things like create private Snapchat stories, so not everybody saw everything that she posted. Lastly, the social relationships that kids on the spectrum do or don't develop through technology has to do with a lot more than just the choices that they actively make. The degree to which a given child might be seen by others as friendly or approachable in the first place is heavily shaped by societal factors, including racism. And this is especially true for autistic youth in online and offline spaces. This idea is reflected in the image pictured of a young man named Knox holding a sticker created by his artist activist mom, Jen White Johnson, who actually created Knox and Jen actually created the art that's on the cover. I commissioned the art that was already made that I asked if we could use for the cover of the book. And the sticker reads, "Black Autistic Lives Matter." So Mom Audrey, with whom I spoke, was keenly aware of how her 9-year-old Black autistic son, Caleb, who also had ADHD, was vulnerable to being read by others as aggressive and violent, which could directly impact interactions, whether he had them with classmates or with institutions like the police. How did this shape out in their media use was that she didn't want Caleb listening to rap songs with lyrics about guns or lyrics about murder, because she worried about classmates or friends hearing him repeat those lyrics. He had a tendency to kind of hear music lyrics and just repeat them over and over again. And she worried about the potential social impacts of that if he didn't really fully understand the meaning of those words. So what to do with all of this information? So my analysis, I think, has a lot of different implications, at least as it pertains to friendships and social relationships, for parents, for clinicians, for policymakers, and other stakeholders in autistic kids' lives. So the first is that there's a lot of value in kids on the spectrum being able to play and practice interpersonal interactions and relationships online without all of the risks that come with being fully or publicly networked. And there are ways that I think parents in general sort of have on-ramps for their kids on how they, maybe they at first only have texting and no apps, or, that there is some sort of, it's not as if you jump into the deep end right away, but there's something more, I think, scaffolded that autistic kids would benefit from, where if we could either design, curriculum around this or particular kind of platforms that aren't just jumping right into the deep end right away, but places where autistic kids would have the opportunity to reflect on what a researcher, Katie Davis at Harvard, calls spheres of obligation. So different social sort of audiences for who you'd be presenting yourself to online. So that might be thinking about the people that you know, your interpersonal connections. What are the norms in the online spaces? What are the broader cultural norms that exist outside of just the internet, and how all of those potentially shape the relationships or the interactions that you have? So more opportunities for scaffolded learning about sociality that's mediated by media and technology. And that could even start as early as like taking turns when it comes to games and all that other kind of stuff too. The second is the idea that children's technology use, as I mentioned in my talk at one point, I think there's a lot of folks out there who are giving a lot of talks perhaps about social media and technology and its potential negative effects for young people. And some of that discourse almost seems to kind of separate technology use into, okay, it's either something that kids are using socially, and maybe when they're doing that, they're sort of active and they're productive when they do that, or that they're antisocial and therefore passive and it's all about consumption. And that can end up excluding autistic youth because it tends to center how neurotypical people tend to prefer to make friendships and build relationships online and offline. As I mentioned, kids on the spectrum like Brendan might be repeatedly watching YouTube videos, for example, that provide them with instructive examples of social situations. And lastly, it's important to understand that these social differences in autistic kids' experiences of interpersonal interactions and relationships across different types of, are different across different media types and content, different in terms demographically, in terms of age, in terms of their class background, and significantly, so I only mentioned kids here who did have the ability to communicate through oral speech. In the book, I talk about a lot of different examples of kids with intellectual disabilities and autism, but still how media can in different ways meet their social needs as well, especially if we think about how media can be a really important bridge and a connector for kids who might not have much in common at all. Like if you can talk on the playground or at recess, you can talk about Paw Patrol, or you can talk about another show you like and another kid does, or wear a t-shirt about that there is a kind of entry point, not necessarily a deeper relationship, but even something that's still on the surface might still be meaningful for an autistic child as a starting point. So building on this, I want to just kind of share some overall digital parenting tips based on the research that I conducted for this book, as well as some different other studies that I've conducted for helping support autistic kids as they navigate the networked world. So I'm going to break this down into 6 developmental areas. So the first has to do with social development more broadly. And the kind of if there's one takeaway that I would share, it's that to use media as much as you can to help your child communicate and connect. Some autistic kids may actually be more connected than ever to their classmates through video chat with games with chat functions, especially those who might not have been regularly included in after-school play. Other autistic kids may find that texts or Snapchat messages, especially if they cognitively are kind of overwhelmed by something like that, might find that this mediated form of communication can't replace in-person encounters, that the in-person is more accessible for them. For parents, then it's a time to, I think, in terms of friendship, might not be friendships, but it's still social relationships. Whenever there's the opportunity for things like family movie nights or even playing video games together, to use those productively to support your child's social communication skills. In terms of emotional development, something to share is to try to be attentive to how media can both stress and soothe an autistic child. So children on the spectrum can be very empathetic, so much so that material like the news, be it on social media or on TV, can be emotionally overwhelming, very overwhelming. Others might express emotions in a more reserved way, but are choosing media content that helps them process experiences of disruption and change. So some autistic kids that I kind of see in the later years might be drawn to more fantastical kind of fandom content, in part because it might help them process complex emotions with those richer narratives. It's important, though, in general, to help autistic kids learn to regulate their emotions in ways that don't always involve the comfort of a screen. I'll get into kind of some more reasons why that, again, could be detrimental. So cognitively, something to keep in mind is to help autistic kids become critical thinkers about media and technology. Some autistic kids have the ability to fully grasp the complexity of what they see and read online, while others might not understand that the content they're watching, for example, on YouTube is an advertisement, or what is or isn't appropriate to post on social media, or how to actually verify somebody's identity, or perhaps to verify the veracity of a photo that they might see that is actually doctored. So one tip in general is to meet your child where they are through their personal interests. For example, you can talk about things like generative, AI and photos that don't look quite like they're actually believable by making up some of your own, using a child's special interests. Then you're able to kind of talk through what the moral aspects of that are, the ethical issues, watching things together, doing things together, explaining and modeling in very concrete ways, things that could be confusing to them or too abstract. Behaviorally, it's very important to set reasonable boundaries around media, but to also give autistic kids an active role in what those rules could or should look like. So media can provide a sense of routine for autistic children who thrive with clear schedules and plans. But some might be sensitive to excessive media use, negatively impacting their ability to self-regulate and transition to non-media activities. To help with this, it's important whenever possible to involve kids in making predictable and safe choices about their media and technology use while respecting their agency and helping them to make good decisions. So this is a big one, sleep. I kind of have now kind of started to say, if you're going to draw the line somewhere, sleep is a good line to draw it at. So consider how media can work both with and against a child's sleeping habits. In general, autistic kids tend to have non-normative sleeping habits to begin with. So not having to, when it came to the pandemic, not having to keep the early schedule of school by attending classes online might have been a relief for them. But when others in the home are sleeping, media can be what's keeping kids, company, instead of potentially disrupting the sleep of others. Of course, if you think media before bed is making things worse, then parents should consider enacting small changes for developing new routines, like not using screens an hour before bedtime or so. But it can be more serious. There were certainly kids in my study who would wake up in the middle of the night to game, and parents had deep concerns about self-regulation and impulse control. And so they had to really more firmly draw the line on that than anything else, in part related to the fact that sleep and physical well-being, there's such a high correlation between having a good night's sleep and good physical and mental health. So lastly, creativity. And that's to give autistic kids large canvases, both physical and digital. Some of the autistic kids that I spent time with had amazing artistic skills. So having, so potentially for some unstructured time leads right to a meltdown. But for some of them, the kind of structure of projects, something like digital, even something like a Minecraft project, was very motivating for them. But of course, there are many autistic kids who don't have a lot of resources, who don't have internet access, which limits the possibilities of their creative potential. But again, I found kids who, they had access to YouTube, and so they would, drawing videos on YouTube and would, draw all Pokemon that were in the specific Pokemon universe, and were very interested in those offline ways of creativity too, and using technology again as a jumping off point for doing that. So to conclude, I've selected a picture here, also one that's drawn by a girl on the spectrum, illustrating 3 friends sitting around together. Basically, autistic kids, they are kids, and like all kids, they do have fundamental needs for feeling known in the world. The relationships that they forge can look like those of neurotypical children, and yet they might be quite different in other respects. Understanding autistic kids' mediated peer relationships through these four lenses that I talked about: scaffolding, agency, safety, and social factors, allow us to reframe some dominant ways of thinking about technology, but social interaction and society that can ultimately exclude neurodivergent people from kind of public conversations. So with that, while I have your attention, I should say that if you are interested in taking part in any of the ongoing research that I am conducting, I do have two studies that I'm recruiting for at the moment on neurodivergent children. And I mean here actually those with a diagnosis of autism and or also separately ADHD. And it's on the ethical implications of extended reality technologies, so like VR gaming, in their lives. Kids don't have to have used VR before to participate in the study. But the flyer on the right is for focus groups that I'm conducting with adults, so parents, educators, and clinicians of anybody who works with or has a kid with an autism or ADHD diagnosis that's 8 to 13. And the flyer on the left separately is for an study I'm doing with the kids themselves to interview kids 8 to 13 with an autism and or ADHD diagnosis, and for parents to fill out a short survey. Please email me at m.alper@northeastern.edu if you are interested in hearing more about either of these studies. Again, if you're a parent, a professional, a clinician, a teacher, or all of those, multiple of those things. So with that, thank you for listening. And if you're interested in hearing more, you can, again, my book is available open access from MIT Press. If you are somebody who likes a QR code, you can even pull it up here. That takes you directly to the book's website. And you can feel free to look up some of my other research on my website, merylalper.com, connect with me on LinkedIn, or send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alper. That was great. As a speech therapist, I use technology in sessions with kids a lot. We have iPads. A lot of my kids make their own YouTube videos or play Roblox, and that's how they connect. So I think a question I have is for families that have the question for their therapists around, well, the American Pediatric Association recommends this more limited screen time. How would you respond to that, kind of as someone who's done research to see, there are challenges, but there are these real benefits too? Kind of what is your go-to kind of spiel that you give?
Yeah. Well, first, to acknowledge that the guilt that parents feel is real. Usually when they're coming with but the American Academy of Pediatrics says this, it's because somebody has made them feel guilty. Usually somebody shamed them in public, et cetera. And I found that parents, so I have a study that I did on this actually, where I asked parents about their experiences with talking with clinicians about screen time. Like, what advice did they get from clinicians? And very often they got mixed messages. So maybe one type of clinician would say one thing and one would say another thing. So I'm thinking of, for example, a kid for whom had a lot of difficulty with adequate food intake, very kind of quote unquote picky eater. And the child's feeding therapist just said, you know what, if they are only going to eat when they're in front of a TV screen, then put them in front of a TV screen because this child needs to eat. And then when the parent went to the pediatrician and there was a question about, screen time, the parent felt like nobody was on the same page here and felt very overwhelmed. So I think that's sort of an issue. One piece of advice I think would be to sort of make sure that your child's entire care team, that you can get a sense of what is happening in sessions or what is happening at school, so that there's a real shared sense of what your philosophy is. What are your actual values around media and technology? Not just arbitrary rules, this amount of time for this, but what are your actual beliefs? And hopefully who you're talking to will listen, but because there can be a lot of not taking that into account when it's just easier, when it just will help you meet, will help you kind of, get to the end of things quicker.
That's helpful. Thank you so much.
In terms of the PowerPoint, I can share those with Megan, and if you want to, have those posted or sent to anybody who registered for the talk. Let's see the question here. Children with concurrent conditions. Yeah, that and how communication brings some challenges and opportunities. Yeah, so it was really multi-layered. So as I mentioned, there were kids for whom a lot of kids who did have significant communication impairments that took part in the study. And one big differentiator is whether or not they had access to reliable access and training to a form of communication where they could be understood by family members and non-family members. And really, that was such a minority of the non-speaking kids that I got to, interact with. And so in the absence of a reliable form of communication, for some kids, music was a real key in being able to convey their emotions. So making choices about the kinds of music they wanted to play as conveying their feelings, or being able, and whether that was actively saying, this is what I'm feeling and I'm saying it to somebody else in this way, or parents interpreting, oh, my child is listening to this. I know this is what they're kind of feeling at the moment. So expressive forms of media, but weren't necessarily talking. This is something that I also kind of talked about in my last book, was really powerful. So having access to music, even if you don't have the ability to communicate through oral speech, or again, you do have the ability, but your access to tools that would or facilitate your capacity to communicate in a reliable way is limited. Music was something that was really powerful. So screens. So I think triggering in terms of I think maybe part of what that gets to is, for some kids, the sensory dimensions of screens. A lot of it depends on the content and it depends on the child. But for their kids who are sensory, it depends on what sensory dimension you're talking about. If you're talking about visual sensation, if you're talking about sound, some kids who are more sensitive, and some kids who desire more sensory input. So kids can be sensory avoidant, and they can be sensory seeking. And so that kind of sensitivity, or kind of a lack of sensitivity, so the sort of triggering, it's important to think about, are there settings to create a more gentler experience? And that might be things like turning off autoplay. The YouTube Kids app some of it can be a little more kind of fussy, but it can potentially be a gentler experience than just regular old YouTube. And I found that almost none of the parents that I was spending time with were aware, or at least not using the YouTube Kids app. Now, this might have changed since 2020, but they were not using this app. That it came way later in the game in terms of YouTube rolling it out. People just started off with YouTube on your browser, or YouTube on the app. But parents just didn't really know about YouTube Kids. Some who didn't like it either, the ones who had really gone out of their way. But again, it's in part thinking about what can be, if your kid is highly sensitive in this respect. Are there also just other media forms that then are screenless? So just because it might be related to the screen, is a podcast something that your child might be interested in, or something like Alexa. Like, your child can still have access to information or access to music, and potentially in ways that don't involve always interacting visually with a screen. So it might require some alternatives, but there are ways to potentially, but it's important to understand what those actual triggers are. So I found that in my research, that for some kids, it wasn't necessarily even just the actual screen. It was some very specific content, specific high-pitched sounds or tones of voice, even, that one parent who had said that there was one PBS Kids interstitial that when their child, it was either on, or that their child thought it was going to come on, their child hid behind the couch there was something about like the man's voice in whatever that interstitial was that their child had to, it was a distressing situation. You wouldn't necessarily think PBS Kids, like distressing media content, but it was for this kid. So it can be unexpected in terms of what those actual triggers are sometimes.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Alper. This is fantastic. I've been looking for something like this, kind of more going deeper into information around technology and neurodivergence, and this was so fantastic. So I will send everyone the recording, the slides, and Dr. Alper's contact information. If you want more information like this, get involved in research. That's the only way we get more information. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.